Hello, welcome everybody to our online session of Fading Lights, or better Defining Lights, which is the result of our research project that we did together with RITS and Stockholm University of Arts. I'll present myself first. I'm Chris van Goetem. I'm a teacher and researcher at RITS, as probably many of you already know. And I'm working at the moment on the history of lighting. And I would ask Anders to present himself.
Thank you very much, Chris. My name is Anders Larsson. I am situated at Stockholm University of the Arts in Stockholm, and I will actually send this presentation from Stockholm. So you will meet me in Stockholm and Chris in Brussels. I will also take the chance to mention that I have the students from production design in the studio here. So we have a little audience, a small audience. And helping me also with the technique is my colleague, Jimmy Svensson from the Department of Opera in Stockholm. It's also part of our University of the Arts. I will start with, before sending everything over to Chris again, I will start to put up some light, some footlight that's going to be lit during the whole performance. And I will ask my students to, or the students to go on with this small work to put the light on the footlight, on the candles. I have also another candle here on my table, and this is a type of measurement instrument for time, because when this candle is burned out, then 1 hour has gone. And we will see if we make a small intermission then, or if we proceed with the presentation. Maybe in the background, you could see also a very nice costume. It's typical. We take the other light and see if that works better. The costume you see in the background on my behind me on the stage is very, very nice, done by the costume designer and person working in the department for costumes, Nils Harning. And if you wonder a little bit about, maybe you could actually turn the camera a little bit so you see also the costume. If you wonder about the cloth, it's not from the 1700. It's coming from IKEA, and the cost was 80 Swedish crowns, 8 euros. So it's you could actually achieve a lot of good impressions even with small amount of money. Saying that, I'm going to send this over to Chris again for continuing this presentation.
Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is nests and things that never happened, but were very important for history. What do we mean with this is that we talk about nests of innovation, moments that people come together by hazard in history, and innovation starts. And we see different of these nests happening in history. So we were looking in our research specifically to, that was one of the elements we were looking at, is these nests, and to see what happened and what they made in changing the history. The second thing we're talking about is things that didn't happen. This is mainly technology that is invented way earlier, but didn't make it, because they didn't have the means, they didn't have the lighting power and so on. So that was another focus to see what of this technology is reused or can be reused. A nice example of this is Pepper's Ghost, for example. that was used a little bit in theater, but never got to its maximum, and is now reused in 3D projection in theater. But let's take you through a little journey through time, and then we start with everything which is natural light. And I think Anders is the best person, because he visited all these open-air theaters. He's the best person to explain this.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, you could see that we have chosen a picture from the Epidaurus Theatre in Greece, on the Peloponnesos. It's one of the most impressive outdoor theaters you could visit. Actually, this one is a very good representation of how the Greek used to work with the natural light. It's situated in the direction, so you follow the sun during the day. And when I say follow the sun during the day, it's because most of their performance was played during daytime, starting in the morning, having small intermission when it was totally warm in the midday, and then in the afternoon they continue the presentation. And instead of saying in the play that it was during the night, they could have a black curtain to represent doing the representation of that it was at night during the scene, or they could use torches also as a symbol or a sign for night. But it's also some, especially when you're sitting in the Epidaurus Theatre, you see over the, actually to the other side of the valley, to the mountain, and there it is some indication that they used bonfires to also indicate that it was during the night and it was a distant place actually. So that was one way to use the natural light. I think we should take the next slide, Chris. And you will hear this a lot during the presentation because Chris is running the slides from Brussels and I'm standing here. This is an example from actually the time of the Vikings. We think, or actually the archaeological think, that this was an example of the oil lamp, but in a different way. Yeah, I think you have seen a lot of different oil lamps from the Mediterranean area, and they look quite different. And I'm going to talk a little bit later on of how they were used and how they were produced, how they produced light actually. But the main idea was that the Vikings did use oil from especially animal, but it could also be from actually fish, because you get also oil from fish. Chris, I think you could continue with the next one.
And now what we're talking about, well, basically what you see is my kitchen. In the way, as the way we do research is we don't believe books, but we're trying to look in how does it really work the way it was described in the book? Does it really smell that way? And this was quite a nice example where we went to the local butchers and we bought cow fat. And we melted that down, we cleared it out, and then, so the first phase you see is the rough fat. The second phase is the clearing where you get all the dirt out of it. And then you get kind of a white, nice substance that looks rather good like candles. And then you can pour bit by bit the fat over a normal cotton string, and bit by bit create these candles. One of the things you read in every book is that they smelled very much, that they were very ugly, and that the smell was very ugly, but also that you had a lot of fumes. The strange thing is that when we made them, they hardly smelled at all. So that is one of the issues that we are still wondering is what could be the reason that everybody describes it. And one of the things we guess is that it is because we are able to clear way more and way better the fat than they would be able to do in that time. And that's probably the reasons why this works pretty well. We even had dinner together with a candle like that, so it can't be as smelly as they told.
Actually, Chris, could I make a comment on this one? This container has a lot of tallow in it. So for that reason, you could imagine that because this is what we produced, I think nearly 3 years ago, but it's still quite okay to actually smell. So it's very strange. It doesn't smell so awful that it says in every book. And what we found out also, because if you take a look at the slide, if we could have the slide back again, to the left in the slide, sorry, to the right in the slide, you see an beeswax candle, because that was the next step. And the beeswax candles is produced by, this is a sheet of beeswax, and you roll it, you take some wick, this is wick by meters, and you cut the length of the candle, you roll it, and there you have a beeswax candle. It's very simple, and you could do it very simple at your home. My two candles here, one is this is pure beeswax, but this is a combination of beeswax and tallow. And as we understand it, they combined the two materials to actually, it was so extremely expensive to have just beeswax. So they needed to have it combined with something else so they could actually have money for running it. I think that's what's explained in that slide, and we could proceed to the next one, Chris.
Yes. When we talk about animal oil and animal fat, it is regionally defined in the way some regions have more sheep or have more cows, others have more pork, for example. One of the issues is that when you have pork fat, it has a lower melting temperature. So what happens is that you can't make candles out of it. Czech Republic is a very big consumer of pork, so they had a lot of pork fat. So they find a solution, and they made kind of a mix of pork fat and sand, and in that way they were able to make candles, be it that they were contained. Another thing, but Anders can tell more about this, is vegetable oil.
Yes, here you have two very good examples of what you could find in the Mediterranean. I think the smaller picture you have seen, nearly everyone has seen some version of this one. That's a quite common oil lamp that you could find in the Mediterranean era. But that one to the little bit bigger one you see to your right, that's a little bit confusing. Actually, I had a summer vacation and I went down to the palaces of Knossos, and in the museum there I found that one. And that's not from the Knossos era, it's from Roman period. And what's a little bit special with this one is a multi-wick oil lamp. So you see every little small outlet there, it's a place for the wick, and in the small, let's call it channel, you put your oil. So it's it is a container for oil with approximately 40 different wicks. And of course, that will be a very, very good lamp when you actually start that one. I will also, I think, we're coming back to a little bit more about the oil, the different oils. So I think Chris takes the next one with the rushlight.
Yes. So another quite typical lighting instrument, very small, was a rushlight, and an alternative was a taper. A rushlight is basically a little wick made of the rush plant. And the nice thing on the rush plant is that it has kind of a very soft, spongy type of inside that you could soak into oil or grease. And by doing so, you had a little stick where you just could walk around with. A taper is a little bit different because that's kind of a wick that is put in wax, and that is mainly used. You see that sometimes in churches now, where they use it to light candles and things like that. But it shows that most people in their normal daily life only used a very minimum of light. They hardly used any. So their perception of light is rather different than ours. On the other hand, on the outside you could have bigger light sources. A cresset is a nice example, which is basically kind of a basket where you throw all kind of rubbish in that you can burn, and you add tar or pitch to that. And that really gives good flames. There is one still standing outside in the harbor in one of the places in Stockholm, for example. So it's really a light that is used for larger open air areas, but with all the smoke that the tar creates, it's impossible to use it inside. What we do see is that a lot of cases there is a reference to torches. Now the thing is, if you look at visual material from that time, these torches don't look so much as the torches we know from the movies or so on. It's more like kind of a very big candle. And because they're also used inside, we presume that probably they are kind of thick candles, probably with several wicks and with rather thick wicks. So they give more light than a traditional candle. You call it a torch, but it's not the wooden stick that you would burn and that you see sometimes in the movies. To be honest, there is very little reference to the use of light for performance in theater or in events or in plays. One of the rare sources we have is Abraham of Suzdal. He's a Russian bishop, and he goes to Rome for a big meeting. So he's traveling for months, and he visits two church plays. And the strange thing is, he's a bishop, but he's a very technically experienced guy. So he understands very well how the mechanics work and so on, and he describes them in detail. He describes, for example, a big ball with lights around that turn around, but the lights stay up, a bit like a Cardan system as we use it now. So we do have some references, but a lot of the things we read and see, it's very hard to figure out if they really were actually as they were. So there we go to our first Italian nest, and that's a typical example. You get this region in Italy where Sabatini is living, Serlio is there, Torelli, Furtenbach, and one way or another they all influence each other, not only in mechanics, where they do pretty well, but also in lighting. And if you see to Sabatini, you see for the first time that he's really talking about how to do things. Sabatini is in fact the how-to wiki from our times. So he talks about the details, like, oh, you have to take your lights out of the way when you do changeovers. He also is the first that mentions that you can put lights on top as kind of a border light to light the heavens. He talks about poles in the wings, and he talks about footlights, which he absolutely doesn't like, because he says they're smoking and the visibility gets bad and so on. So there we get for the first time a real image of how a lighting setup could look like. If you look at Furtenbach, he even makes a drawing where you see that he lights the borders, the painted borders for the first time, and he puts extra light for the backdrop. So that is the first mentioning of really working in that way with borders. In fact, if you look at this drawing, you start in the Renaissance with what they call a heavens, which is kind of a closed ceiling that is painted. And then Sabatini explains that you can kind of cut that in pieces and move it a little bit around so you could work in between it. Furtenbach goes further and hangs them almost diagonal with lights in it. And then if you go a step further in the Baroque stage, they're really hanging up down with a light that is always is lighting the borders, but also giving a little bit of light down. So if you look at a traditional candle or oil light setup, it's basically footlights, it is side lights, and chandeliers. But all the light is in the front of the stage. It's very hard if you go deeper, it's very hard to get enough light in the middle of your stage. If you look at the Sommi, he's is one of the first references to not just getting light somewhere, but also creating the right type of atmosphere. He talks about if you have happiness, you need a different light. If you want to have joy, you need different light. Or if somebody died or it's very troubling, then you need a real different type of lighting. So he's the first thinking also about the functions of light. In this period, they do a lot of experiments. They try to color light with colored fluids. They try to dim lights. They experiment with things that start to look like lenses. You have the black lantern of Guy Fawkes, for example. So there is all kind of experiments going on, and you feel that all these different people influence each other to create something new. But I think Anders can tell us something about the different fluids for coloring light.
Yes. And now I'm going to ask my students to help me to move the camera, because I want to show you this one, and I hope you could see. Here we have 4 different bottles. And today we have used, I think you could take down the light over the table. So it's just this that shines. And you see the bottles is filled with, it's just pure water, but we have added, this is actually color for food, these 3. But this one is a natural thing. It's sulfur that gives this wonderful yellow color. And of course, they used something similar. And I was reminded today that, of course, when you have color, you want to dye your clothes, for example, you could choose a lot of materials from the nature that gives different types of light, the color. And I think the most difficult one is blue. I'm not sure what you could use for that one, but I'm absolutely sure that it's something from the nature you could use, actually. For the red one, they normally used red wine in different, sometimes very concentrated and sometimes like this. So they got a lot of different values of the color. So I think that was what I could show here. Chris, you could take it.
Yes. So
the next one.
One other thing is that they didn't really have lenses, but they started to understand how that works. And one example is the dentelier, which is basically an instrument that was used by lace workers to focus the light of a candle. So they put a candle on the table, they put a ball on the table with water, and it would focus the light on their work so they could continue working in the evening. And you see a similar thing in the Wonderbaum, which is kind of a tree. There the balls are filled with colored liquids, and it focuses the light towards the audience. So that you start to see that all these type of things are happening. For dimming, we not only have the Sabatini dimmer that you all know, but we have also, for example, this system, which is from Drottningholm, and I think Anders can tell more about that.
Yes, when you hear about dimming today, it's very simple. You go to a light console and use that dimmer. But during that time, it was a little bit more complicated, because the only way to dim candles, candles that are lit, that is to take them away in some way. So for the footlight, it was a system where you could lower the whole foot ramp down to the basement. And you could do it securely with the side lights also. So they turned out and the footlights was going down. That was a kind of dimming system you had, and that was possible to run, at least in Drottningholm. I think most of the theaters had similar system, but I'm not, the one in Drottningholm, I'm absolutely sure because it's still there. Now I'm going to ask my student to help me again with the camera. Because we are taking up, or actually you could start to tell a little bit about this slide, Chris.
Okay. One of the problems with natural oil, with vegetable oil or animal oil made out of animal fat, is that it can't reach a height. You can put a wick in it, but the wick is very limited. The wick is has only a small distance. The oil can move up. So the problem is, if you make an oil lamp, it needs almost continuous attention. One of the inventions we see is a floating wick, which is basically you put the wick on a little floater on top of the oil, and if the oil gets consumed and gets lower, the wick will follow, and in that way you will continue to have light. Of course, this is a thing that is not only important in theater, but especially in churches, because they wanted to have lights that could continue 24 hours a day. So in fact, you see these floating wicks still a lot in older the church equipment. These floats
Chris?
could be, yes?
Chris, I can take, if I have the camera now, I could show you a little bit about what we're talking about. So if you change over to my camera, instead of the slide.
Yeah, you can talk.
The live camera from Stockholm. That one, correct. And Alvin, yes, good to turn it down. Here's two examples of the floating wick. I hope it is a little bit visible in the camera also. It's two different types of oil. This one, to your right, it's the oil that you're all familiar with. This is actually virgin olive oil. So this is very, very common to everyone. And it's a very, very nice flame of it. This one is rapeseed oil. And the rapeseed is very common in the north part of Europe. And you could actually produce an oil. Most you use it for when you boil, or you have it on your food or in your salad, but you could also burn it. But the problem is that if you compare these two flames, the olive oil is pure, it's clean, it's no smoke out of it, but from the rapeseed oil you get a lot of smoke, you get a lot of bad combustion, and therefore it's very, very dusty when you actually burn it. So I think you can switch back to Brussels.
Yep. So then what we see is that there starts to be different uses in Europe depending on the country. People use their lights in a slight different way. What you see in England, for example, is that there's way more work on one hand with chandeliers that are used in indoor theaters. But at the same time, they train the actors to use a candle or a small chandelier themselves to light each other. And in that way, the use of candles became part of the play. On the other hand, where you work outside or even inside, because the light is kind of fixed, it's not only the lighting, it's the way you play, it's the way you deal as an actor with lighting, as you can see here on the quote of Walter Raleigh, is that it's also the actors can play dark or can play light. Good. We quickly move to real oil lamps and, oh, sorry,
Chris?
yes?
Maybe we should take the opportunity to say that if someone has comments, please post them into the chat. And we try to actually have an eye on the chat also. I'm helped here with my student. And we're going to do some small breaks between these chapters. So far it's no one who has posted anything in the chat, what I can see.
Good. So now I have to
Yeah, okay.
go to the oil lamps again?
No questions so far, but in case you're allowed to post your questions and we make a short stop after.
Okay. I
Yeah,
just see in the
second,
chat we
Chris.
need to buy red cabbage, but that's for later.
Yes.
Oil lamps.
Good.
The thing
course.
is that the things you see here on the slides are not oil lamps. The reason is the reservoir is lower than the wick, and as I said before, the oil can't move up enough to burn there. So often we miscall lamps as oil lamps, while in fact they are mostly petrol lamps. That's quite an important thing to say. In theater you see this type of oil lamps. They're not nice, but they give a lot of light. They have 5 wicks, a reservoir which is kind of low, so it can at least can burn for 2 hours. And in that way we can create, you see kind of a mirror, but not a really mirror, but kind of a shiny object that reflects the light in the right condition, in the right direction. Important is that you really start to see an improvement when the Cardan system comes in. The Cardan system is something you've probably seen in a bird cage. It's this little cylinder with water, with a little thing where the bird can drink the water. And it's because by drinking it puts a little bit of air in it that there is more fluid coming into the output of the container. And Cardan built, in fact, a lighting source that worked in the same way. So if the oil is burned, then there is a little bit of air going into the container, and in that way they were able to work with vegetable oil for longer time spans. And you see these as the first oil lighting system that lasted longer in theater. The next step is what Argand is doing, and in fact you see he uses the system from Cardan. So he uses the container and the way to get the oil into the burner, but he adds an entry for oxygen. He makes sure that in the middle of the flame there is more oxygen coming, so you get a way bigger flame. And he puts a chimney in it, which makes that you get flames like 30, 40 centimeters high sometimes, which of course is very practical for theater where we want a lot of light. Of course, these are very nice examples, but if you look at the ones you find back in theater, they're just ugly because nobody sees them. But practically they are the same, and they're used as footlights and they're used as side lights. Okay, we jump a little bit further, and we go to open flame, but then mainly to gas light, limelight, and petrol light. One of the things you see is around the turn of the century, around 1900, is that everything is used at the same time. So you see, on one hand, you still see oil lamps, but you see gas light. There is limelight in use, there is petrol lights in use, there is arc lights in use, and the first use of electrical light. And it's all being used at the same time, because it's not because something is invented at one moment that it also will be used directly at that time. People buy equipment, they use it for 20, 30 years, and only after that they will change. What we also saw, we looked into the theater yearbooks of the States, for example, that it depended a lot from region to region. Some regions had petrol lights, while the others already were working with electrical light. Okay. If we talk about gas light, again, we're not talking about this type of equipment. This is what we use on a camping site, and it has kind of a gauze in it that creates a very nice and brilliant white light. But that's not the type of gas light we're talking about. In fact, what we're talking about is a very bad combustion. In the way, if you have gas light and it burns perfectly, it has the perfect mix, you get a very blue light, which doesn't give any lighting energy. It gives a lot of heat, but it doesn't give. So in fact, you need kind of a bad combustion, which gives a nice big yellow flame. And these, the gas was often coal gas, made from coal in the origin. You could roughly control it with opening and closing valves, but never one light. It was always a whole row of lights. You had footlights, you had side lights. They reused the cardan system with the chimney to make the flames a little bit higher. And very importantly, they have the first plug. In the way we are used to plug things in the wall now, they created the first system where you could have a moving spotlight with a rubber tube, and you could put it into a water slot. And that's what they call the dip. And if I understand well, in England still plugs in the floor of the theater are called dips, which is coming from the gas connection, like that. We can have a look at three main types of light. The first one is a single burner. It's just a small flame. You have a pipe, a little opening in that. You can light that, and by making little holes in the pipe, you can control the amount of oxygen that is entering the flame. Second is what they call a fishtail, which is basically a flame that is flat. So you get a larger surface that gives light. And the third one is an argand type of light. I'm going to show for a second the video. I hope you can all see this. This is at Per Edström place, and he shows the different types of burners there. So you see the single one, there you saw the wing, and then further on we will see the more argand type. And you see the flames are pretty high, and we kept them quite under control because often they could be bigger. And you see wing lights that work pretty well. It's an amazing place. If you ever have the chance to visit it, it's great because it has candlelight and gas light and electrical light, and you can all test it out. Gas, on contrary of candles or oil, can burn upside down, in the way that you can make burners that are turned, so it becomes easier to create border lights that also light the actors. So it's not longer only lighting the border, but it can also light the actors. So there we get a little bit better. But basically, and that's what a thing you see in almost every change. In the first place, they take over the positions of candlelight, and they just change the burning system. It's only later in a second version that they start to invent new type of things. We see a little bit of color, which is basically kind of a cotton or silk colored fabric, which gives a tint to the light, but it's always the whole of the batten that is changed color. So it's pretty difficult to really talk about real colors, but at least we could try and do a little bit of that. And it's always the whole stage. There is not such a thing like a spotlight. So what you see in gaslight is we have a higher output. We have some control over the intensity, but if we talk about control, we talk about more light at the front stage or more light at the back stage. It's not like lighting just one actor. We have some control over color. The positions stay largely the same, but you get extra top light, and a big advantage is we have control over the house lights, which means for the first time it is reasonable to lower the light in the house and get the focus to the stage. We found this one back, but I think Anders can tell more about that. It's the typical setup of a gas system.
Yes. In the mid of 1800, the Royal Opera in Stockholm, the Royal Theatre, it was called then, actually changed over from candlelights over to using gas light. And you could see here, it was a lot of burners. It was 66 in the footlight. To have something to compare with, this stage that I have behind me, it's 2 meters wide, and we have 24 candle wicks. And if Alvin could turn my light down, my presentation light down, or take it out, you could see it's quite weak in the intensity. We could take my light back again. And it was beside the footlight, they had 8 sets of wing lights and also 8 border lights. And it's a small discussion going on when you take a look at the conversation, or actually the papers and notes from the head of, well, it was what we should have been calling now the sonographer, saying that, well, everything became so bright when we got this gas light. So from these weak candlelights, we had a massive light when we got these typical gas light. And I think the next slide is Chris that could say something more about, but it was the same used in, same type was used in Sweden also, but you have more information about this one, Chris.
Yes. This is kind of the high end of the equipment. In most theaters, you just saw valves that you could turn open and closed. This is a Clemenceau, a French brand. One of the nice things, it has a master. It has individual controls for the different lines, but it also has shunts. So there is always a little pipe passing the valve that makes sure that you leave a little bit of gas on, because one thing you can't do with the flame is give a blackout and then go back to light, and you have to relight all your burners. So that is a bit of an example of it. And this also makes that you can start to make use. And this is what we found back in Stockholm. And as I don't read Swedish, Anders has to explain what it means.
Yes, and you have have to have very good eyes to see what's written there on the paper. This is what we could say the first light script we have found. A light script that says now full with the red gas light, now full with the blue gas light. And it was, of course, something covering, so it gave the impression of red and blue. Some kind of filters, but not as what we call filter today. The interesting thing here is this was the first production done with gaslight. It was the magic flute. So it's very, very easy to compare it with different kind of productions of the same, different kind of magic flute and the solution for the light. And since the archive in the Stockholm Opera is very, very good, it's very easy to find back these type of information. And we are lucky to have this because it's a good, it gives good information about how they used the gaslight to lit the different scenes in the magic flute. Chris, I think next is yours.
If we have cues, we also need rehearsals. The first one that did, for as far as we know, lighting rehearsals was Henry Irving in the Lyceum Theatre in London. And of course, because the actors didn't want to rehearse at night, the technicians had to do the lighting rehearsals at night. You do understand I'm a technician, I guess. Bram Stoker, who you probably better know from Dracula, in fact was the financial manager of Irving, and he describes in some essays all these evolutions that are going on. One of the things he feels are pretty exciting is that because if you have lighting under control, you also have darkness under control, and darkness becomes as important as light. It becomes an effect which we couldn't reach before. And as you can create darkness, you can also use that to make people do things on stage without being seen. So he's the guy that gave all these technicians silent shoes and dark clothing, which is basically what we still are wearing today. So if you wonder whose fault it is that all technicians are in black, it's Bram Stoker's fault. Gaslight is pretty dangerous in the way we're talking about an open flame, a large flame, and a lot of them. If you look at theater fires over history, you see that there is way more theaters that burned down during the gas era than during the candle era and everything which was before. Theaters that did burn down with candles mainly burned down when there was no audience, because they forgot candles or something like that, but rarely during performance. While in theaters lit with gas, you saw a lot of accidents happening during performances. The picture you see is a picture from a newspaper describing an accident with ballerinas who, one of the ballerinas wants to change something on her shoes. She bends over, her tutu gets on fire. The other ballerinas come to help her. Their other tutus get on fire and they run around all over the theater. I thought that was quite an exciting story, but that it was kind of an exception. But more and more we started finding other accidents that happened in a similar way. So in a lot of cases, actors got on fire because they came too close to the gas lights that were pretty big. Okay. Enough about gas on its own. The next step is limelight. And what we are trying to do at the moment is we're trying to build an accurate limelight, but also to create our own lime. We're experimenting with lime that is put together, but we're still looking at the right shape, and we have to do something on the mix. So it's not perfect yet, but I would like to, before I have to say something, limelight, there was no gas containers. in the way the gas was kept in kind of leather bags, and then you get a bag with hydrogen and a bag with gas, and you had to put pressure on them. And they did that with mainly putting weights on top of that. The risk story is that limelight operators also used their kits to give enough weight, and then they were silent and they didn't have to keep them at home. But let's have a quick look to the limelight we are trying to build here. It's an experiment still. It's basically an oxygen and a gas bottle and a stone of lime that is heated. I'm going to try. I'm not sure if it works, but I'm trying to get. So first you get the flame of the gas that is big, and then when we add oxygen, in that way we kind of light the stone. It gets white hot, and by doing so we create light. What is so important in this is that this is the first moment in history where we get a point source. It's the first time where we get light coming, a lot of light coming from one point. And that changes a lot of things because it makes it possible to manipulate light. Before you could have more light or less light, and maybe you could kind of box it off a little bit, but basically you always had kind of a wide source. While with this one, we are able to really focus light, and that's a pretty important thing. I have a little video that is also made in Per Edström's place, where you see, this is another type of limelight. This is a navy one that is used for signaling. But you will see that it's, first you have a big flame and then you control it till you have a very blue flame that heats up the stone. And by doing so, you really can create sharp lighting. I think you'll see that in a second, that there is a circle that is really very focused, which was a thing you couldn't do in advance. So the limelight really brings us something extra into our possibilities of lighting equipment. For the first time, we can light one actor. We can focus on one thing, and we can use light to decide where the audience should look like. Okay, so that's about limelight. We start with electricity, and we start first with an effect and not with lighting on its own. I must say, the more I read of Erning and his technical things, the more I start to like it. One of the things he did is he gave an actor, he wired an actor on his finger with a wire to his foot, and then he could put his foot on a copper plate, and another actor could do the same thing on another copper plate, and they were both connected with a power supply, and then the actors could point to each other, and they would get sparkles between each other. Which is, I think, kind of a nice effect, but I'm not sure if we would still be allowed to do things like this. Okay, but that's not really lighting. The first really lighting we see is the arc light, which is basically the same thing as these two actors did, but on a larger scale and on a more controlled scale. And that's basically the first electric light where you get a very, very wide color temperature, a very high color temperature. And you can use it, it's a point source also, so you can use it with mirrors. This is an experiment from France, and there they start to invent all kind of little things that you could use in theater. This one, for example, is rather a nice example. It's a little arc light in a mirror that could be used on stage, and where you literally could kind of walk around with. They could have spotlight just like the limes. They could use the arc light because you can focus it. And because it's stronger, you could also create different effects. One of the nice ones is to create a rainbow, to project a rainbow on stage based on a prism and a line light. Or to get the sun passing behind a backdrop. That type of thing. Very experimental, but bit by bit they get to more standardized equipment, but always used by an operator. As you don't, an arc light is something that is only controllable if you're next to it. So you always would have spotlights with an operator, and they lasted for a very long time in the form of follow spots. Why? A lot of light, very white light, very controllable, and for a follow spot you need an operator anyway. So I think the last arc lights are shut down in the 70s, 80s only for follow spots, not for regular.
If I can add some information there. For example, the follow spot was used in Stockholm in one theater until beginning of 1980s actually, and the follow spot operators, they had to be built in special small rooms because they had to have separate ventilation because it was extremely hot and warm. But you could also, until around 1970s, find them in cinema projectors, and they were quite common until beginning of, let's say, end of 1960s. So also the place you have seen it for sure, if you have gone to the cinema until around 1960s, was the use in the projectors there.
One of the nice things, yes. One of the nice things in having such strong light is also that you can make better effects. And Pepper's Ghost, what you probably all know, is one of these good examples. But we're still talking about effects, about an extra spotlight or so on, but the basic lighting was still gaslight or so on. That's only changing when we get incandescent light. And we get the first light bulbs in 1870, something like that, with two main competitors, Edison and Swan, that created the war of the currents, but also the war between the different light bulb types. And the first theater that is set to be fully lit is the Savoy Theater, 1880s. And you see again a lot of single bulbs, basically the same setup as you would have in a candle setup. At the same moment, they do the international exhibition. These international exhibitions are great because at that time there were so much inventions that if you read the yearbooks of these exhibitions, you find all kind of fantastic stuff. And you see there that the lights are in exactly the same position as the gas lights were. You have footlights, you have side lights, and then you have one or two spotlights to get a little bit focus. But mainly, the positions are identical. The place of the operator is in the side wings or under the stage. But never, so most operators hardly saw what they were doing. And that's quite of an important thing. The fact that we have light bulbs means that we can color them individually. And in the first place, we didn't have RGB, but we had red, blue, and white. And there were two versions. If we found back the bits for the Theatre of Kortrijk for the first electrical lights, for their first electrical light system, And it's kind of a fun story because we found two almost identical bits, and the way we thought they were identical, until we started to look further, and then you saw that they made the first bit. Probably that was too expensive, and 2 weeks later you got a second bit where they cut out all the fancy things that were too expensive, and where they, for example, said, okay, yes, you can have a dimmer for each color, but if you want, we can make a switch and then you only need 2 dimmers. Or worst case, you just dim one color and you switch the other 2. Just to get that a bit cheaper. For the light bulbs, they said, well, there is 2 versions. The nicest version is we color the glass, and you have colored glass that's perfect and everything you want. But we can give you a cheaper version with dip bulbs, which basically means that you dip literally a light bulb into a paint, and then you get quite nice colored light bulbs. The fact that we can change color now in a rather dynamic way also makes that the way sets are painted is changed. And the way, this is an example, there are several of these in Kortrijk, but this is one by the Ronaldo family. And you see that it's way too blue. It's painted way too blue. If you look at it at the eye, it looks a little bit unnatural. But if you start lighting by this blue pigment, it becomes possible to create a day and a night scene with the same set just by changing the light. So we made a little setup, so let's have a look at that. Okay. So I have a little set that is painted by Wendy that is here. Thank you very much again, Wendy. And we have kind of 3, maybe we should cut for a second this one and we see it better. You see that the color is really changing by just changing the different, the colors of the set. So we can make all kind of different versions basically of the same set. Okay, so we go back. We're still working on a larger version of this one, where we will have a full theater set. This, what you see behind me, is in fact our 1:4 scale model that we originally made for Baroque machinery, and that we are now reusing also to get electrical light in there. We want to have some little gas lights in there, and probably we'll also make some automated machinery in it. So it's reused the whole time, and we still can do that. Again, we go to the Stockholm Opera House.
Yes,
and
I think I could do some presentation on this one. When we had the gaslight, we were still in the old opera house, actually founded by the Swedish king Gustav III. Due to a lot of accidents around Europe in the end of, on the second half of 1800, they found out that that type of theater building was too dangerous for the audience, too narrow stairs and so on. So they decided to take it away and build a new one. And the new one was opened 1898. And of course, that was exactly in the beginning of, well, not exactly in the beginning, but it has been become more common to use electric light also in public buildings. And besides, it was normally started in the street with street lamps, but now it was also common for having it in public buildings, as, for example, Stockholm Opera House. It was a lot of lamps, but they were also weak. I think I've not seen any exact figures, but I think they were around between 15 and 25 wattage. So they were not so very bright when they were lit. you could see here it was approximately 40 lamps per color in the footlight, and I think they used 4 colors actually. It was red, blue, green, and white, or actually yellow. And then they also did, they had 9 border lights, also with 40 lamps per color, and they had set or wing lights in the same arrangement. And I think, Chris, if you go to that one, yes, you could actually see a very good picture of it, because this is from the AEG, I think. Is that correct, Chris? It's the book. It's the yearbook that AEG did publish 1910, 12 years after the opening of the house. But since it's taken from the back scene or upstage towards the downstage, and you see the auditorium in the back, it's very easy to actually calculate and see how many lamps and where were the place of them. We have, I think, Chris, you have to take over because we have to reset our screen here in Stockholm.
Okay. So what you see here is that it's what they call a bunch light. It's still with light bulbs. It's basically the same thing as you have top lights and bottom lights and footlights. But in a short, in a box. And this is a bit a way of getting a little bit of focus or putting something behind the door or whatever, but without really having a focus. So you see, even at that period of time, you hardly see any spotlights as we know them. Dimmers in that period of time were fixed, in most cases in one of the wings. Very big dimmers, starting with salt water dimmers, then we go to resistance dimmers, then we go to auto transformers later on. There were some experiments with color control, where you had kind of glass cylinders that could turn around the light bulbs or could move up and down in the wings, but rather limited. But people were pretty creative. Kliegl, for example, installed a system where they really wanted the operator to see what was happening. So what they built him kind of a little box next to the prompter in the middle in the middle of the stage. So we could see, and he could do the general control. So somebody else was doing all the presets, and he was kind of doing the general control of that, sitting in this. But it's kind of an interesting way of being a lighting operator, I think, in this sense. We go back for a second to Bram Stoker again, and he's also complaining when we go to electrical light. One of the issues that he has is, you know what, if you dim this light, it changes color, which was a thing we didn't have when we worked with a gas light. A small flame is the same color temperature than a big flame. So he was very unhappy with all these color changes, which is, if you look at how we look now to the changeover to LED, kind of an interesting statement, because now we say there is a problem with LED because it doesn't change color when you dim it. But again, he saw that there was advantages in the way of the effect, but he also found that the light was way too white, which is rather odd because the light bulbs of that time had a very low color temperature. But compared to what they were used to, they were way whiter. Compared to what we are using now, they are really yellow. So there again, it's only what you know that makes your perception and gives you the issues with the change. Now, to give you an idea is Richard or Doyle wrote something about gaslight and the changeover to electrical light. And one of the big issues with gaslight was that it consumes an enormous amount of oxygen. So if you would use all these gaslights in a theater and you would not have enough ventilation, it would be hard to breathe in the theater. It would be difficult to, because you wouldn't get enough oxygen. We found back a book from around 1880s, if I remember well, where they explain how to create a good air conditioning in theaters, giving extra air, for example, to the ground rows, because otherwise people wouldn't be able to breathe. And there was a lot of, let's say, mist in the house. So the move over to electrical light was a big advantage also in the quality of life of the actors and the people working there, and especially the people sitting in the house. Color became more and more important, not only in theater, but what you see is people start to create all kind of theories about color. Think on Goethe's theory, but also what you see is at one moment playing color becomes a separate art form. So people created color organs where they could only play colors or play colors in combination with an orchestra and so on. And the colors were projected on a larger screen. So bit by bit people start to look at, okay, but what does this mean? Is there a relationship between color and music? Can we represent notes in different colors and so on? And they even created rather complex machines where you could project colors, you could project shapes, and you could buy small versions for yourself at home. So there you see that the more you can manipulate things, the more important they also become, and the more creative we start to be with that. And there we get to a second nest. And the second nest is in Dresden, where you see Appia, where you see Fortuny, where you see Linnenbach, you see Barb. Appia, of course, discussing the way light was used in the past and also the realism that was used in sets. And he wants to go to a shadowless light where within this light he can make kind of a focus. We see Linnenbach at the same time creating a projector where you can have more or less abstract shapes on your background. And by doing so, it kind of connects to what Appia is doing. Fortuny goes a step further in the way he develops this cupola. It's kind of a quarter of a bowl shape that is used as the background of your theater, which makes it possible to have endless images, because you don't see any lines anymore. It's just a bowl shape where they're in. And he's projecting there with spotlights, not with gels, but with reflection. So he creates kind of a scroller with different types of fabrics in different colors. And he puts a spotlight on there, and then it reflects color over the stage and over his background and over his cupola. So you see they're all kind of going in the same direction, learning from each other. And of course you have Bard there that is inventing all kind of new machines to support this. And you have Gehling that is in fact for the first time mapping images on a stage. So you see this, you create kind of a movement by bringing this different inventive people together. You create strong innovation. On the other hand, if you look at most stages in Europe, they didn't really change. The romantic painted sets are not disappeared from one moment to another. So this is one of the things that was pretty early, that has helped changing our ideas about lighting, but it didn't change in the way that they expected it to be changing. When we go a step further, we go to the first spotlights. And there Siemens and AEG, who were the first companies that are really delivering lighting equipment the traditional way, they start to bring in their catalogs bit by bit some spotlights. But spotlights, you still have to imagine that they are really operated. It's not the spotlight as we use it now. And then in that period, from the 1900s on, you start to see everywhere popping up specific lighting companies. Strand, ADB, Niethammer in Germany, Century Lighting, Clemenceau in France, Pani in Vienna. Bit by bit, you start to see specialized companies. AEG and Siemens were not specialized companies. They built power plants and they built theaters. These companies really focus on the theater work, and you see the first examples of spotlights. It's only when we saw this picture that we thought this is a nice group picture. This is technicians setting themselves up as if they are working. But in discussions we had with different people, we realized this was their normal working position. This was their position during the performance, because this was the only spotlights they had. So, and they were manipulated the whole time during the show. The rest of the lighting was still the general 3 or 4 color lighting they had in the overall stage. And then you see bit by bit getting all this lighting equipment from the big houses to smaller houses and even to amateur theaters. And one of the things, I think that's for when I'm pensioned, but what I would love to do is Fuchs wrote in 1939 a little manual on how to make your own wooden lighting equipment. And that was really meant to get this technology that was used in the big houses, to get that also into smaller houses, amateur theater, and so on. So I would love to do that, and he's a big fan of asbestos, so we have to find a way to solve that, because I don't think that's very legal. Anyway.
Before you go on, I want to add something that's not in our slideshow. And that's 2 weeks ago, I found back the information about one spotlight inventor in Sweden. The most companies that produce spotlights has not been situated in Sweden. We have actually been, AVAB has been the owner of Emil Niethammer company, but we have never produced a spotlight in Sweden except for one. And the inventor of that spotlight, he was a sound engineer who worked in the film industry. And he was so upset about when you're turning the spotlights off, they are always making a lot of sound. And he couldn't stand that, so to say. So he decided to actually build a spotlight out of cast iron instead. It became very, very heavy. It became very, very good. It was mostly Fresnel's. But the irony is that not all light equipment is invented by light people. It could also be sound people, strangely enough, because this one was very, very, very good. And it was still in use. I think here in the school we have had it for, I think the last one went out, we took it away something 10 years ago. So they were in use for a long time. The company was called Fototon. And this is a little bit side story, and we have not included it in our slideshow, but I got that information just 2 weeks ago. So I think it was a good time to add it now for this presentation. So Chris, now we can go on.
Okay, and now we come to my favorite question. Are we technicians or are we artists when we operate lighting? And in fact, that decision is a little bit made, I think, by Strand Lighting. On one hand, they created this fantastic lighting console where you could play light. You could literally play. And on the other hand, they created preset boards, which is a very technical way to setting levels. And in fact, the preset board won. So the difference is that if you have a console, you always make a creative interpretation. It's not absolute. It's you look at the play, you play along, you play together with the actors. It's creative. While with the preset, it's a very accurate, precise reproduction of a play that has been played long time ago. If you work with the console, the design is kind of a process in the way it evolves during the operation, it evolves during the rehearsals. While if you use preset, it's a product. It's a finished product. It's a list with figures on it. So if you have a console, you really are an artist. While if you have a preset, you're kind of defined as being an electrician. And I think maybe we should try to turn that around, but that's another story. Let's go a bit further, because what we see is in this whole discussion on different operating boards and operating ways, we also start to change the way we think about lighting. Is one of the reasons of that is people's perception framework changed. Before, they only had daily life. Their only perception, their reference framework was daily life in the way they used light at home or in buildings or whatever, but very limited. And if they were very rich and very lucky, maybe they also could use some paintings as a reference. But for the rest, they didn't have really reference into lighting. But now, once we have cinema and magazines and so on, we have a way wider reference framework of how lighting could look and what we tell with lighting. We have cinema, we have pictures in magazines, you have TV, you have the whole rock and roll scene. So we have a bigger experience with lighting, and we have created ourselves more of a language of what lighting can mean. That started mainly, or it's hard to say in most cases where things started. In most cases, we say they start when somebody puts them on paper or when somebody develops them into a methodology. But that doesn't necessarily mean it didn't exist before. There is only no traces of it. But I think that McCandless, by writing the different books, is kind of the father of stage lighting, because he spread the news. And he creates the principles of lighting that we're still building on, in the way it has to be visible, it has to be natural in a way, it's about the composition, and you create atmosphere. And you have a plan with different steps to work on that. Which ends up in the method, as we call it in Europe. I'm not sure how they call it other ways, where you kind of organize your stage in different fields that you can light in different ways, and how where you make difference between cold and warm light to create depth and so on. On the other hand, you see Swoboda, for example, where that really uses light as an object, that makes light visible into the space, which is an extra step we take into this thing. And then I have to promote a little bit Brussels, but in 1958 we had the Expo in Brussels. And the building on the left is now standing in Prague. That was the Prague pavilion in the World exhibition. Is now standing in Prague and is now called the Belgian Pavilion, which is a nice thing. But mainly he introduced projection, and moving projections into performance. And the first Lanterna Magica was not in Prague, but was in Brussels, by the way, by Swoboda. Okay. We go a step further, you get people like Pilbro that extends what McCandless has said and goes more in depth. So bit by bit, we start to understand better what parameters we can use to manipulate light, to change light, to tell a story. And there, more and more also we get more parameters we can control, and that gives us a language. So there you get the model where intensity, color, distribution, movement all come together and become part of our daily language as...
Chris, I have
Yes?
to interrupt you a few seconds. My measurement was, I was wrong. This was 1.5 hours. I'm a little bit surprised actually, both of the candle and the shortness of the time. Someone has stolen 1.5 hours from me, but the presentation will go on. We will have approximately 25 minutes more and take some questions in the end. I know we have a lot of questions in the chat. Please go on and post them as we could maybe actually come back to them. And some of you are familiar for us and we could answer you later on. And those of you who we don't know, we should take an extra look at these questions. But now I take the candle out here, or actually the fire out before it starts the fire. And then we continue for approximately 25 minutes more.
Okay.
Please go on, Chris.
So, what we do see also in this period of time is that the different countries, different regions start to use this equipment in different ways. In some cases, the focus is on Fresnel light for general light. In other countries, they use PCs as a general lighting. Some countries use LICOs, others use profiles. So bit by bit, you also start to see, let's say, cultural differences in the way we make light. And not unimportant, design becomes a profession. It's not longer the electrician turning on or off the lights. It's not longer the director saying, okay, can you put something red here because there is a weak moment in my play. Do something red, then people forget that this is the weak moment. Now people start to think about lighting, start really to create this language, and they become on billboards. And in theater, it's only like this, that you only exist if you're on the billboard. So, pretty important. Does this mean all these movements and these changes are all getting everywhere at the same time? Absolutely not. If you look at, for example, Woodstock, the lighting set was rather limited in the way it was a set of follow spots. There is no local festival that would agree to work like this now anymore. But again, by, let's say, the poverty, you see a lot of new creations coming. People are inventive, are creative. One of the nice examples for me is the whole movement on psychedelic light, where they are very creative with very limited equipment. They create fantastic shows and fantastic visuals. Good. Next step is we go to moving lights, which is one fixture that can do a lot of different things and where we have a lot more control. We can control all kind of stuff. The only problem with moving lights is the only thing they don't do is they don't move. They stay in the same place. They can turn around in all directions, but they don't move. They stay where they are. And coming from a traditional lighting background in theater, for me that's a very frustrating thing. The reason is that one of the important parts of our language is angle. Is the angle we use is part of the story we tell. And with moving lights, because the spotlight stays in the same place, if I take another position, I go somewhere else, my angle is changing. So my story is changing. And that is a little bit frustrating. I'm still waiting for drones that we can use in theater so we can correct this little error in the thing. Good. And then we go to LEDs. And now Anders has a fantastic picture here.
Yes. During this presentation, we have tried to actually show for you both the candlelight, the oil lamp, the gas light, the limelight. And it's no doubt that, of course, the use of the light source is of importance for what we could achieve on the stage. And now I've chosen this picture as a symbol for the LED. This is a Rosetta window from some church. You have seen them all around in the world. You can find them. And they are a lot of small colored glasses that put together, and normally they could tell a story. They could actually be a motif or something, or they could just be different colors. And in this case, this will be a symbol for the matrix of LED diodes that we're using in our instruments today. So we could go on to the next slide, Chris. We have not spoken so much about it, but from the beginning, we had 3 different light sources with 3 different colors. And by setting a color media in front of them, we're doing some subtractive. So we just have the colors from red, from blue, from green. And by adding them, we could combine these different colors on the stage, and therefore we produce different colors as it's shown in this picture. It's very, very special because we are, as human beings, sensitive to a very, very small window of light. And that's the color spectrum you see there. It's way wider, but the part that's visible for us is that color spectrum going from red over to blue, or vice versa, depending on from which side you read it. We could take the next slide, Chris. The problem now is that if we want to have different colors with LED source, we need to use the different colors from them. And if we want them to have, actually we could put them into one lighting equipment, lighting fixtures, and then produce different light out of them instead of using color media. And that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to have something like that appears like a white LED, but of course it consists of the 3 different colors to produce this white LED. And then you could still use the color media filters in front of the spotlight. But the filter is not exactly the same as you use when you have, for example, a halogen lamp or incandescent lamp. So it's very, very confusing when you look at, they should look the same when they are lit by different light sources. And they do, but when you look through them, they look quite different, actually. And I think we could take the next slide, Chris.
Yeah. Say there is also an absurdity in putting filters in front of LEDs, because
yes,
one of the advantages is that LED has more power because it doesn't need to filter it. But then if you start filtering it again, we lose all the gain we have on the power.
You're correct. This slide just shows when you're just using 3 different colors, you can't reach all the different parts in the spectrum that you want to reach. And especially the tint colors is very, very hard to go through or come close to. And therefore, some companies has added more colors than the RGB. One is using 7 colors, and I think it's a lot of companies that use a lot of different colors to reach, to go to every part of the spectrum that you want to reach. And I think the next slide will show a little bit about that.
Excuse ourselves to our Indian and American colleagues. Shall I tell a little bit about this?
Yes, please do.
We were
Please do.
experimenting in Stockholm, and we were trying to make a match between LED lights and incandescent lights. And we had a very good mixer, but we realized after a while that the pastel colors, the little tints we like a lot to work with, were very difficult to make in the color mixer. While if we wanted very strong, a little bit greasy colors, they were very easy to pick on the machine. And that's a bit where the idea of Bollywood came from. It's strong colors, very impressive colors, works quite well with LED. But getting nuances in light between different tints is very, very difficult to do. So that was basically a little bit, and we call that sometimes American design, because some American designers like a lot of very colorful interpretations of lighting on stage.
You don't have to comment that on the chat. No. We hope you excuse us for this type of insultants. This is another way to explain what you could reach and what you can't reach with fixed colors. Having 2 musical instruments, let's say a piano and a violin. In a piano, you have given notes, and the tone you get is either from the white keys or from the black keys. And you could compare it with fixed colors. You could reach them, but nothing in between. Well, you could combine two keys and you get some kind of in-between note, but not exactly what you could get from a violin, for example. That gives you an endless spectrum of tones that you could reach. And for that reason, it could be a way to compare that with the color picker you could find in a lot of different light consoles. I think you could take the next one, Chris, and you could maybe describe it.
So let's go back for a second to the complaint of Bram Stoker that said, oh, this is a real problem, this light is changing color when you dim it. Over the years, we really started using amber drift as an essential tool in making lighting. We made nuances in color temperature just by dimming our spotlights. Not only with white light, but also with different color sources. So we adapted ourselves to what Stoker thought was a problem, and we used it as an extra tool in making our light. And now we're kind of losing this with LED. They're trying all kind of stuff out, but it's still very difficult to make this amber drift working. We've had a lot of discussions when Europe wanted to ban the incandescent lights on quality of light. And one of the, at that moment you're not talking to lighting designers, but you're talking about people that know very much about light in supermarkets and homes and so on. It was sometimes hard to explain to them what our difficulties were, why we needed these little nuances, why we needed this ways of working. Because for them, if you can see something, there is enough light, basically. So that's one of the things we will struggle with, I think, in the next years. But on the other hand, we will create new and very creative ideas. One of the things you see when there is a new technology like LED, and you've seen that before in our talk, that, okay, we change the lighting system and we use exactly the same position. We saw the same thing with LED. They took our old fixtures, and they just put new light sources in it. And that's the first step, is we try to copy what we did before. In the next step, you start to see new fixtures. Why would you need to make a whole spotlight if you can have a flat surface giving light? So maybe there in the future we will go back to APIA and just have LED screens all around our stage, and that we can decide how to work with. Who knows? So this brings us more or less to our final conclusion. And at the end we were looking at what happens when we change technology. If you get a new evolution in technology, what happens? An important thing in what we saw is that lighting is a language. It's our way of talking. And our voice is our equipment, in the sense that it's not about the equipment, but it's about the lighting we show. It's a means of expression, let's say. A second conclusion was that we are very early introducers, but very late adapters. In the way everybody in theater is eager to test new things, to experiment with new things, to try new things. But on the other hand, we are very critical in really adapting to new systems. We like to test the things, but on the other hand, we try to keep what we have where we know exactly what we are doing with it. A nice thing is that every technology needs a play guard. And that's what you saw, for example, with moving lights. Moving lights is a very good example for that. The first moving lights that were used on stage, they moved when you walked into the house, they moved during the whole show, and they still moved when you went out, because we had to try all these different effects. I've seen shows where they used every gobo, every color in a moving light. And we need this play garden to play around with that, to develop this language. We need this, let's try everything out, to finally get to something which is really a language, where we know exactly what we are doing. And one of the nicest examples I've ever seen was an opera that was lit completely with moving lights. Nothing moved during the whole opera, except for the last moment, when the last person dies. That's when an opera is over, when everybody is dead. So at when this last person dies, all the spotlights move together to one spot, and then they fade out. And that's the only movement you see in the whole opera. That's when you know when we created a language, that we understand what movement means, that we know how to use it. So in a lot of cases, it's first about understanding the concept, then being able to use it, finding the language, implement it, and at the end, most technologies end up as special effects. All the things you see on our stages that are effects once were traditional technology. Not unimportant is that we want more, in the way we love new technologies, but we like them to add them to what we have. We don't want to exchange them with something. And I think that's an important lesson. It's not because we have all this fancy LED technology that we should get rid of incandescent light, or that we should get rid of even gas light or whatever. We should try to keep it as extra tools in one way or another. One of the issues we encountered is that at the end it's all about standards. If you want, it's all about standards, in the sense that one of the reasons lighting consoles made a big step forward was that we had DMX. We could connect everything to everything. We could move around and talk about the same thing. Same thing happened with computers with USB. Suddenly we could connect everything. One of the problems we have with color at the moment is that we haven't had a standard to define the new colors. The colors that we make with LED, it's always a little bit of a guess. We're not completely sure that we will have the same result in house number A or house number B. And it's all about quality. Is what we want is we have a very high standard on quality of lighting. Talking about lighting temperature, talking about color nuances, talking about dimming, controllability, and we never change to a new technology if it doesn't meet these standards we have. That's a very important element and a lesson to remember. We're very critical because it's a language with so much nuances, we're very critical to this quality. Another thing we've seen through this whole research is that change is a very fast, but at the same time a very slow process. You see a new technology emerging, but before it's really becoming part of a sector, sometimes it takes 20, 30, 50 years even to a century before it's really adapted and taken into our minds. That has partly to do with the way that we work, partly to do with the fact that we work on perception more than on technology. So that is another thing I think we could keep in mind. And then the last thing is, I believe with all the possibilities we have now, and I think we both believe that, with all the possibilities we have, the things we can manipulate, that we can control, and the complexity of the designs, technicians are no longer just electricians. They're really part of the creative team that operates a show.
For those of you who's not been normally in contact with Chris and me, do we have some final slides with our name or?
Not really.
No, unfortunately not. But I think we have been presented by the link for it's your research week now in Brussels. And last time we had this presentation, it was 1 year ago. It was in Stockholm. It was during our research week. So therefore, I think our names and our contact list or our contact addresses are there. So you could actually get in contact with us, I hope. Yes. So, and I know this presentation has been, well, it was said that it should be 2 hours. It's 1 hour and 57 minutes now. So I guess it's good time to end for today, or what do you say, yes. Chris?
I just before we close down, I want to say, first of all, thank you to the fantastic student video crew here we have, and the students' technical theater that built the model for us. And I want to thank you all to participate, because it was great to see all these old friends again. And I have to thank Wendy again for painting the backdrops. I shouldn't forget to say that.
I saw her name there. And I will say the same, give the same thanks to the students here in Stockholm and Jimmy and Nils, who did the fantastic dress on the doll here behind me. And I think we are very, very glad that it worked very well, I think, technical wise. Running this from 2 different parts of Europe into one feed. And I think you had sound and everything you needed during this presentation. So both Chris and I say thank you very much for today. Ni kan väl spara chatten innan vi stänger ner.
My email is in the chat, so write me an email if you want to know more, or if your question didn't manage to get on the forum. And then I thank you very much.
And I also say thank you and goodbye from Stockholm.
Goodbye.